Tonight's keynote address is going to be given by a person that was my first choice when I approached the Department of Canadian Heritage, because he was someone that I kept running into, as did Amos, whenever we appeared at either the House or the Senate Standing Committee looking into Bill C91, or if we appeared at an intensive engagement session, as we did together with Stephanie Pyle in Toronto, or as I was invited once to stand in for Mary Jane Norris at a meeting of Stats Canada that's getting ready to include more sophisticated data gathering techniques for Indigenous languages in the next census. There he was, Stephen Gagnon, whose title has been for a while, may morph tomorrow, the right person, Federal Lead Representative for Indigenous Language Legislation, the Department of Canadian Heritage. And I think it's a great privilege to have Steve come and talk to us at this point in time when the new government has agreed to not only implement the act, but also, as we heard in the speech from the throne yesterday, look into the possibility of bringing in legislation that is going to align Canadian federal laws with the United Nations Declaration for Indigenous Peoples. And those two pieces together, C91 on the one hand and UNDRIP on the other, are going to make for a very interesting new tomorrow for Indigenous languages in Canada. I think we have every reason to be optimistic that this new direction is going to both be followed, but must also be monitored by non-public servant, I'd say university academics, allies, and Indigenous peoples across Canada. We have to keep an eye on what's going to be rolled out in terms of this combination of two acts. They could be very, very positive collaboration together between them. And I think we're going to be privileged now to hear Steve Gagnon give us some insight into what we can expect with the implementation of C91. So Steve, I call upon you to enlighten us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I'll thank Amos in advance for, I think he's already pre-recorded most of my discussion today, so we'll just, it may skip a little bit along the way. I would also like to acknowledge that we're on the territory of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Métis, and the Mississauga of Credit First Nation to conduct our discussion tonight and our time here together this weekend. I'd first of all want to convey the regrets of the Deputy Minister. I hope that my colleague Hélène will report back that I was actually the first choice. I had a conflict, but it is amazing when your deputy needs you to do something, how your conflicts can always find a way to be resolved. But for those of you who did follow the process for getting the language legislation through, our deputy was very, very personally involved. And I've been doing this kind of thing for 29 years. I have never, ever seen a deputy take such a personal hand in a policy development and legislative process. So she was there every step of the way with us, and she really did want to come tonight. And as you know, it's a busy time for senior public servants in Ottawa this week, but I found out last night that she's dealing with a family-related matter and couldn't make it. So she sends her regrets. It's nice to be back in Toronto. I'm actually a graduate of York University. I didn't get to come to beautiful Glendon campus, though. I was on the one a little further west, which, as you know, is in a different part of town. But that's where I went to law school. So I join you humbly. I'm not a language expert. I'm I don't speak any Indigenous languages. I was brought on because I had some experience in conducting engagement and because I had some experience on legislation before. So that's why they brought me. And I have a bunch of notes that nice people in our branch have created for us. And I realized as I was looking at them on the train on the way down that there's some very general stuff here about the state of languages and how important language is to culture and how it is to the land. But I realized that I don't need to tell people like you much about that. You've probably told us about that when we were conducting our information. So I will say though that the journey for the federal government in this started in December of 2016 when the Prime Minister announced at Assembly of First Nations gathering in Ottawa that the government was going to enact legislation with respect to Indigenous languages and it was going to be co-developed. Now, I wasn't working on languages or for heritage at the time. I was with another department, but I was at the AFN Assembly that time. And I can tell you that at least 3 people from the Department of Canadian Heritage had heart attacks in the room because I understand that that was a little bit of a surprise to some of the people there. So it did come from the top. In 2017, our then Minister Joly announced with the leaders of the 3 Indigenous organizations, the national and Indigenous organizations, that they would form a group, a working group to co-develop the language. And so the Métis National Council, the Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, and the Assembly of First Nations and the Department of Heritage got together and started to frame out what legislation could look like. Before I got there, Minister Joly and her parliamentary secretaries held a number of sessions to get feedback, I think largely from people such as yourselves who are experts in the field. And one of the things that came out of those discussions was the development of a number of principles that the co-development partners used to work on how the legislation would be structured. I was hired by the department in 2018 to conduct what we called an intensive engagement sessions. Ian referred to a couple of them. So in the summer of 2018, we did 30 sessions in about 10 weeks, crisscrossing Canada to hear from people. Now, for a guy like me who didn't really know much about the state of languages other than that they weren't good, and excuse me, I'm not a, it was really eye-opening for a non-Indigenous person to go through that. You read about schools, res schools, but to hear about them from a survivor or the child of a survivor, it's quite different. I wish every Canadian could do that. And what did we hear? Well, what I heard was that the current status was unacceptable, that the status quo had to be changed, and that we needed to, frankly, invest as much in restoring language as we did in destroying languages. And I would say the people generally, we have what we call a program now, and I'm going to talk a bit of government for a second. So, if you need me to translate government for you, it's that we have things like terms and conditions and programs, and essentially we were told we don't want to have to make proposals to you to get our languages back. That's inappropriate. So we heard a lot about funding, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about funding. We always seem to talk about funding when I'm in a room and people want to talk about the act, so we can talk about that. We heard that we needed a different approach to, put it another way. We didn't need the federal government, and this is what I heard, to tell us how to fix our languages. That's not what you're good at. You're good at the other thing. You're not good at this thing. So what we need is support to let us fix our languages. So yes, we know that it needs to be controlled by Indigenous communities, Indigenous organizations, for sure. We know that the Western style of teaching, classroom teaching on our schedule, doesn't work as well in some Indigenous communities, and that we needed to broaden our minds as public servants and policy developers as to what would constitute a language or culture event. And we excluded certain things because we defined language very narrowly. That was not acceptable. We also learned that we needed to be careful about how we told Indigenous communities who could teach their languages, and certainly a sense that we need to be more respectful of the role that elders can play, and that, you know, our system of accreditation doesn't necessarily replace the wisdom that's gained through years of actually speaking the language. So it was, as I said, quite a, an eye-opening experience for me. It wasn't always easy, but it was certainly well worth it. And we used the information that we had to develop a bill. We did, from our perspective, co-develop the bill. The bill was tabled in the House of Commons, the new House of Commons, on February the 5th of 2019. And it was the first bill tabled in the new House of Commons. And I want to talk a little bit about the tabling, because it was quite a different story for me. I don't know how much people here know about what happens when a bill gets tabled. And we were there, and it was a big day. Like we were really jacked, but though I was proud. You know, we worked on this, and we were going to put it in Parliament. And tabling in Parliament with much pomp and ceremony is actually tabling. Somebody walks up, puts the bill on the clerk's table, and the bill's tabled. That was first reading. Now, we had a number of people, myself included, in the gallery. The National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations was there. A number of his senior officials were there. There were other people there. And as we were filing into the gallery, we realized, what's going on? Well, no, he already tabled the bill. It's been done. So Minister Rodriguez, who tabled it, was very gallant and gallantly got up and started to try and make a speech about, you know, how important this was. And he was looking at the gallery, and the speaker just said, "No, you're out of order, sit down." So it was a little bit anticlimactic. We went through a pretty hectic period from February to June to get the bill through the process, and many of people here, I suspect, contributed somehow. I know you appeared, Amos and Ian, and Ian told me that he followed the proceedings. So you might have seen the one where the minister said that I had been detained by security. I was a little bit late because I don't know if you've ever been to Parliament Hill recently, but the security is much, since the tragedy of a couple of years ago, much more elaborate than it once was. So there were 3 or 4 committee meetings starting at the same time, and I didn't have what we call a hill pass, which is basically like the Willy Wonka golden ticket. You can walk, you don't have to go through security, you can just get right in. But I didn't have one of those, so I was late, and the minister, my seat conspicuously empty next to the minister, and he said, I think he said something, I was detained by security. I was actually just stuck at security, but I was at committee a lot. The deputy, I think we were there 4, 5, 6 times. We did briefings of MPs. We were very proud that the bill got all party support in the House, and then it went through the Senate. There were a number, I can talk about that. I'll go through the act in a little bit to talk about some of the amendments that were actually made at the both in the House committee and at the Senate committees. The bill received royal assent on June 21st, and I wasn't at that because I'd been warned about this. Royal assent also sounds like it should be a very, very big event and very, around much pomp and circumstance. And we even did it formally. The Governor General actually went to the Senate. And apparently what happens, I didn't see it, but apparently what happens when royal assent is given that way is the name of the act is read out and the Governor General nods. That's it. You just got royal assent. So I kind of wanted, I don't know, fireworks, maybe it's confetti a little bit, but so that in a way brings, I'll go through the act a little bit because I think there's some pretty important things in there. It starts with a very comprehensive preamble. And the preamble sets a context for a statute, and it does talk about the recognition of rights related to Indigenous language are core to reconciliation and fundamental to shaping the country, particularly in light of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. talks about Canada's commitment to implementing the United Nations Rights Declarations of Indigenous People. It talks about the need to recognize rights as being protected by our Constitution. It talks about Canada's role and with policies and practices in assimilation and contributing significantly to the erosion of the languages. Talks about the importance of language to culture, culture to land, and that Indigenous peoples are best placed to take the leading role in reclaiming the language. There's more to it than that. I'm skipping over a bit, but I think it sets a very nice tone for what comes after. The Act includes what we call a non-derogation clause. So in other words, nobody is expected to give up any rights just because we've put this legislation in place. There's a very, I think, a fairly elaborate purpose section of the Act. Every Act now federally has a purpose. And the purpose of this Act, among other things, is to support and promote the use of Indigenous languages. And an amendment that was made, I believe, in the House of Commons committee was including sign language. So that was added after the original bill was tabled. There are a number of examples of the way government could help support languages. Talks about creating technical tools, the kinds of programming, mentorship immersion programs, language nests, that sort of thing. One that was very important, we think, was that the Act is to establish measures to facilitate the provision of adequate, sustainable, and long-term funding for the reclamation, revitalization, maintenance, and strengthening of Indigenous languages. To my knowledge, that's the only federal statute that makes that kind of commitment. Another amendment that was made at committee was to facilitate meaningful opportunities for Indigenous governments and Indigenous governing bodies and organizations to collaborate in policy development in relation to the implementation of the Act, which I think was probably prompted primarily by the national chief. He was very concerned that the work that had gone in, the collaboration that had gone into creating the legislation should not end with the tabling and their passage of the legislation. There's a section that, Section 6, the Government of Canada recognizes that the rights of Indigenous peoples recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982, include rights related to Indigenous languages. This was something that was debated and discussed a lot to get the wording right, to get the concepts right. We had some internal government debates, as only probably can happen in government, where how can we recognize and affirm something that's been recognized and affirmed someplace else? And finally, I think the deputy just said, no, we're going to do that anyway. Don't worry about the grammar. Again, the minister is required in a number of ways to consult. He has to consult on adequacy of funding. He has to consult on the appointment of the commissioner and the directors that will be in the commissioner of the Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages. We have the ability, the minister has the ability to enter into agreements with Indigenous governments, provinces, territories, organizations to further the purposes of the Act, but to also support provincial or territorial kinds of jurisdictional things that may help support Indigenous languages. And there was an amendment to one of the sections on cooperation that said that we could, the federal government could enter into agreements for purposes such as providing Indigenous programs and services in relation to education, health, and the administration of justice in order to create efficiency and effectively supported languages. Now, there was one of the issues that we had, and primarily with Inuit organizations, and I'm not going to speak for Inuit organizations. You have President Kotiarki who will speak to you tomorrow about that perspective. But one of them was, and it may come up in other contexts, I think Amos, Ian, and Ms. Pyle wrote about the need to work on education. We were trying to be very careful that this legislation not look like it was imposing obligations on provinces and territories in fields of their jurisdiction. Certainly, we support the goals of increasing the use of those languages and increasing Indigenous languages in justice, in health, in education, but we want to do it in a way that's respectful of the jurisdictions. And so we're trying to facilitate a way to cooperate rather than look like we're going to be imposing those things on the provinces and territories. And I will say that from the contact we've had with provinces and territories, there was some concern that maybe that there were unintended obligations that were going to be placed on them. We've said that we don't think that's the case, and from my perspective, the bill has been openly accepted, and then people have indicated in the provinces and territories that they are looking forward to working with us on some of these things. We also have the ability to, we wanted to be clear in this act that because communities were self-governing, had agreements with modern treaties, or there were rights in treaties or other arrangements, that they weren't going to be excluded from support to help address their language priorities. However, when you have these kinds of arrangements with Canada's self-government or modern treaties, there's a fairly elaborate series of implementation apparatus that exists already, managed by Minister Bennett's department. And it's clear in the legislation that the option is for the self-governing group or modern treaty holder to say whether they want to use one of the avenues available through the legislation, or whether we will help them through their implementation arrangements with the Government of Canada to do what they need to do. One of the other important amendments that came, and this was introduced in the Senate, was that there was a commitment to access to services in Indigenous languages. So federal institutions, in accordance with the regulations, can provide access to services in Indigenous language if the institution has the capacity to do so and there is sufficient demand for access to those services in that language. So one of the difficult issues sometimes for the federal government was a concern that we make a commitment that we couldn't meet, that was not implementable in the time frame we committed to. So we talked about the discussion around where there's capacity and sufficient demand, but we were reminded by people, our co-development partners, that that's not a get out of jail free card, Canada. If there is not capacity, then you're going to have to do something about getting capacity where there's demand. And so we've taken that to heart. We can also achieve these same goals through an agreement contemplated under, well, I won't go through the section numbers with you. And then we get into the Office of the Commission. I know that the paper that was written by colleagues was quite elaborate on this, and I don't know, you may want to speak to it later, Ian or Amos, about what this should be and shouldn't be. I can tell you, though, that this was one of the issues that surprised me as I was leading the consultations across the country. There was a wide variety of opinion on what this should be and what it shouldn't be. But ultimately, it boiled down to a couple of things. One is the Commission, in the view of most of the people we spoke to across Canada, the Indigenous people, was not supposed to be a watchdog for Indigenous communities fixing their languages. It was supposed to be a resource. The watchdog objective was to monitor Canada's implementation of the agreement and Canada's funding for languages. So one of the other main things we heard, and this was always the struggle, because some people wanted a very, very elaborate office, much along the lines, and I think I put Ian and Amos in that camp, at least with where you were when you wrote your advice to us. That was along the lines of what you'd see with the Official Languages Commission, and his ability or her ability. I think it's a gentleman now. But the countervailing argument was, do not create a huge bureaucracy that's going to take up significant amounts of funding available that could go to communities to resolve language issues, language priorities. So we tried to find a balance. There is one commissioner who will be supported by 3 directors, up to 3 directors, to do the work. And yeah, I'm sure you have questions about that. We can talk about it. We're still in the very early stages of this. So the Act itself received royal assent in June, the very last day that the 42nd Parliament sat. It was nail-biting time. We were very concerned that we were going to run out of time and it would die in the order paper, but it got through. The main front part of the Act, the things I've talked about the most, came into force. So in legislative terms, became effective law in late August 29th. The balance of the Act and those provisions are mainly to deal with the Office operation of the Office of the Commissioner and the reporting requirement timelines and that sort of thing will come into effect the earlier of October 1st, 2020, or the appointment of the commissioner. And the reason that we were told that we should think about delaying it was our experts in the government who do this kind of thing, we call them machinery of government people, said, well, if you have an office that can take complaints, but the person who takes the complaints isn't appointed yet, it's not really much of a power. It's not effective. So we tried to find a balance between a commitment to making sure we'd get it done quickly, but not make it so that people who wanted to go and talk to the commissioner had no one to talk to. But we were also told, but you're not getting unlimited road to put this off. You've got you've got a timeline. Get working on it. So that brings us probably to where you're more interested in. Well, where does that leave us now? And I like the term the wake of the act, because wake's pretty small. We're in early days of implementation here, and we are trying to find a new way to develop policy. And this is why Ian sees me everywhere, is because I'm told by people that I got to get out there and hear what people have to say. There's an awful lot of collaboration required to make this work. I know that what I feel is the promise of this act is going to be meaningless if people don't think we've implemented it appropriately. So we do need to work with people. We do need to hear from people, and occasionally people even tell me things that I'm not happy to hear about and I don't want to hear, but I have to hear them anyway, because that's kind of what they pay me to do. So we're in early days. We have formed a steering committee with the 3 NIOs, Assembly of First Nations, Inuit Tapiriit Kanatami, and the Métis National Council, to talk about a couple of priorities. One is funding methodologies. We know with all the requirements of, I think the word adequacy of funding is it's set out 3 times in the act, so it's important. And also the appointment of the commissioner. This is going to be the first time around, I think, especially will be hugely important. So we're trying to figure out what is that process, who's involved in that process, who provides advice to the minister, because ultimately the minister doesn't make these appointments. They're the governor and council, so it's a cabinet process. So our minister makes recommendations. So we're in very early days of this. We're reaching out to other groups as well. We're reaching out to modern treaty holders and self-government. We're talking to provinces and territories. We talk to groups like this, and if you have ideas, and I don't know, Ian, I asked the question before whether or not at the end of the colloquium you have a report that will come to us or something, but I'm sure we'll be talking about it in some fashion at some point. So I think with that, I will leave it, and I will say to you, Merci Miigwech, thank you for having me, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
We're going to have a moderated question period between Amos Key and Steve Gagnon.
You can start the beats now. So this portion is going to be about asking questions directly to a representative of Canadian Heritage about the Act. And we're early days, as he said, but what's most important is the establishment of the commission. And there should be some great questions about how that's going to roll out. And he might have some answers. He might have some great suggestions from the floor. So we have some microphones here. We're trying to document as much of this conversation as possible. So if you don't mind coming to the microphone so we can all hear your question. But if it's the first time we're going to have a piece of legislation on Indigenous languages in this country to represent Inuit, First Nation, and Métis. So it's early days, exciting days. Those of us who have been in trenches and in the grass all these years, we're looking towards having finally a piece of legislation that protects our languages and gives us and recognizes our rights as Indigenous people to languages. So, questions, comments. You can give comments too. Doesn't necessarily have to be a question.
Great,
yeah. He's playing as waiting. No, just kidding. you go to the microphone and thank you. Just identify who you are and so we can support you.
My name's Adam Richards. Am I live here?
Is he on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I want to know, forgive my ignorance, but are all the public distribution and financing and funding methods already in place as part of the act, or are they still to come?
Sorry, thank you for that. I should have mentioned that I'm going to get chastised now. Federal budget of 2019 committed $333.7 million over 5 years to support the implementation of the act, with 115 million ongoing. So yes, there is some funding. We're now dealing with groups about how to make decisions on how that money should be flowed. I got to say that we're as a government in the transition between the old approach with proposals to hopefully getting to a place where more goes out through core agreements rather than proposal driven, but we're still working. It's early days, but yes, there has been some money invested in this, and it was a significant increase from the previous amounts of money that have been going into the programming. I think, frankly, the programming started at $5 million a year. So my poor colleagues were fielding all these great applications with no money to give out. In 2017, the budget was raised to approximately 20 million. And now it's 333 million over 7 years with 115 million ongoing. Now, I will dramatically foreshadow, you're going to be hearing from a gentleman named Roger Jones tomorrow from the Assembly of First Nations. Certainly know that organization does not believe that the funding that was provided in the budget meets what they believe the test of adequacy is in the act. And so that's one of the things that we're talking to people about, including them. Thanks.
Any questions, yes?
Kiitos skaten.
Mm.
Edlarote, Sherry and Sigasun, Nitswapone Cotinia, Egoni Sagitani Tuske when the University no Helotene Thiots and Nestame Maganak Quills. I bring greetings to the people of these territories and to your ancestors, and thank you for welcoming us to share in this conversation with you. My question regarding your presentation, and I think perhaps when you were in Edmonton, I asked this question as well, because we hear a lot in this about modern treaty holders and self-government agreements and provinces and territories, but we're not hearing about treaty. So I'd like to hear something about where treaty fits into all of this. I also want to acknowledge that there are many divergent perspectives on this Language Act, and that there continue to be some significant concerns amongst First Nations and amongst our institutions. And one of them is the role of Indigenous owned and governed post-secondary institutions who have been doing this work for 50 years without support. And now that there's $337 million on the table, and for the past few years, as people were sort of seeing this coming up, we're starting to see so much language activity happening in other institutions, almost like they're becoming enough like us that our people won't need us. And so I want to advocate very specifically for support for First Nations owned and governed post-secondary institutions that are doing work in language as part of that capacity building responsibility. Hi. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for your comment. And I believe I do remember, as a fact, I believe in Edmonton, if maybe I've got it wrong, somebody in Edmonton asked me, it may have been you, why do we even need an act? Because you've got treaties, and certainly I do not want in any way to diminish the importance of the treaties that we don't call modern treaties, the what we call in our world pre-75 treaties. That absolutely, my world, what I did before I came here was I worked on implementation of modern treaties and self-government. So maybe I emphasize that more than I should, but certainly do not want to diminish the importance. And I do know that there are a number of Indigenous controlled post-secondary education institutions. A number of them are in Alberta. And that I think that the Act is broad enough to accommodate those kinds of organizations. So It's maybe just a matter of being educated on how we can do that.
Any questions or comments? Don't be shy. Zach.
But don't be too bold either, though.
Yeah, we yeah.
Be a little shy.
Be a little bit shy. Yeah. Be a little bit humble.
Bonjour, my name is Jody Williams, and I'm representing a provincial organization called the First Nations Métis Inuit Education Association of Ontario. Do you want to wrap that, Amos?
Yeah.
And I have a couple questions. One, I'm bringing forth on behalf of a colleague who couldn't be here tonight, but is coming tomorrow, Dr. Marianne Corbier. Her question is, in regards to funding criteria, if there's any provision that will be made for projects based in universities, even if there is no formal indication of a partnership with a community-based organization. Where this question is coming from, as for example, the Aboriginal Languages Initiative had a provision for this kind of collaboration, but when a community-based organization sees no need to work with a university-based researcher, such as herself, then the work couldn't be funded by the ALI. The consequence, if there's no such provision, is that there won't be a comprehensive assessment of what resources are out there produced by the various entities doing work on Anishinaabe, which is where her work is focused on. And thus the production of yet more of the same kind of resources at the same level being introductory, and gaps remaining with respect to resources to serve adult learners that cover advanced level content. So that's her question that she wanted me to bring forward, basically going to the provisions of criteria for funding.
So I have a, Ellen?
The terms and conditions that we have are very clear that organizations that receive funding.
Should get microphone in. Go for the microphone. Yeah.
Sorry, Len, I didn't mean to put my colleague on the spot. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
She was going to say what I was about to, she's about to say what I was just going to say.
Okay, so our terms and conditions are very clear that the funding should primarily go to Indigenous organizations and Indigenous government. Exceptionally, when a non-Indigenous organization collaborates, we can look at the file, but otherwise we're not permitted to do it by the authorities that we have, by the format of the program. So, and for the time being, this will continue.
So just for clarification, because I have to relay this back to her. So a university that is focused on Indigenous studies, Indigenous languages taught by Indigenous peoples would not qualify under that criteria?
No.
I would
Not
add,
for now.
I would add, so you've raised, and this is always a bit more delicate in a university setting, but you've raised an issue that came up quite a bit during the engagement.
Mhm.
And so there's a struggle in, I mean, not a struggle, how do I say this? We heard a lot about frustration with us dealing with non-Indigenous academic institutions. And the reason that was given to us was sometimes in the past, researchers will go into communities, they will do work, they will talk to elders, they will develop tools that could help the community. The researchers leave the community, the work or whatever becomes proprietary and does not in fact benefit the community that they were in to see. So what Hélène is describing is a balance to say, nobody objects to somebody, you're all experts in helping with this kind of thing. I know that, but we were told that should be the decision that the community makes, not the federal government makes. So that's what we're open to have a discussion, but that was where we thought, that's where we thought we were best reflecting what we'd heard in our engagements, is that nobody's saying don't work with universities, but it should be done in a way that communities understand that they will be able to shape how the material gets used and to benefit from it when it comes out. And you may all be doing that here. I don't know. I'm not saying that's not happening, but I can tell you that I heard that it has happened and that there were some very strong feelings about it when we did our engagement.
Yes, so that's not what the question is coming from. So she's an Anishinaabe, one of the lead scholars on Anishinaabemowin. She's been working in the last 20 years developing the most comprehensive dictionary in this work, and she's hit numerous roadblocks in regards to accessing funding. So when you have somebody who's an absolute expert in the area of language, and how does this, and it kind of sways into my second question. I work in the capacity of provincial schools. And so when we're looking at teachers in provincial schools trying to teach the language, they're chronically underfunded in terms of being able to access funds and also the amount of resources that are available. So there's a huge disconnect when you have proficient academics who are Indigenous able to fulfill this gap. And then, so there seems to be another barrier here. But my second question in regards to, and I just wanted to maybe get clarification on this so that I understand it properly. I realize that this is a federal piece of legislation and that provinces have autonomy. However, is there going to be any kind of accountability or how to hold provinces accountable that aren't actually, that are creating more of these barriers in regards to access to language? So for example, in Ontario, there's been millions of dollars that is rolled out for Indigenous languages as well as Indigenous studies, but it's not what we call enveloped, which means school boards do not have to count on that spending. They can use it on whatever they want, which we know from the work that we do in education, that's what's been happening for years, since 2007. So this is great that we have a piece of legislation, but what I'm interested in is how do we hold provinces account to ensure that, you know, access is happening, particularly with funding when we're already dealing with millions of dollars just bleeding out because we can't hold school boards or the ministry accountable to that money.
You, sorry, to close off on your first point then. We did hear overwhelming, I accept the view of your colleague that there are resources out there that may not be community resources, but we heard overwhelmingly, I feel, that the priority for funding should be communities. Doesn't mean we can't continue to talk about this, because it doesn't mean that we've got it perfectly right, and we may have some gaps, but I think that the program people, there's the people who design our program, we're trying to reflect what we think we heard across the country, and I would argue that's what we heard mostly. On your second issue with respect to holding the provinces accountable, I guess as a federal public servant, I don't view that to be a role for the federal government in the sense that I think you mean it in. Provincial governments are accountable to provincial voters. Now, where this might be some place where we could look at talking about it is in the event that a province, say province, but it could be a territory as well, wanted to partner with the federal government on a project that was in a provincial jurisdiction through an agreement, then we would be able to hold each other accountable through the terms and the commitments in the agreement. So I think in a limited way it's possible, but in the general sense that you mean it, I don't know that we would consider that to be an appropriate role for us.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Okay.
Good evening. Thank you for coming. One of the things I just looked up on the federal government website is in the employee, they're required to learn bilingual when the service has to provide both services. Mm-hmm. How is Indigenous languages going to allow for, I guess, people, individuals in high positions to get to higher positions such as yours or federal judges or Supreme Court of Canada if they don't have the bilingual requirement. So how is the Indigenous Languages Act going to assist with that?
I'm sorry, so are you suggesting that I'm not sure I understand.
Currently, you
Yeah.
have to have bilingual requirements to get to the Supreme Court of Canada.
Yeah.
So we're hoping that the Indigenous Language Acts will help minimize that so that an Indigenous lawyer, judge can get to a higher level within the
Okay.
public service. And the same with the assistant deputy ministers or deputy ministers positions. They have to have the French English bilingual requirement, and that's discrimination.
Well, I don't share the perspective as discrimination, but I think I understand the point. What you're referring to are some of the employment roles in the Official Languages Act and Language of Service. This act that we have, and you've raised a good point that this is not an Official Languages Act. And there was a lot of discussion about that. This is an act to support Indigenous languages. I think the act can support a lot of the objectives that an Official Languages Act can get to. But I don't know that it would be disingenuous of me to say that it's not that we're not going to have that kind of thing in the senior federal public service where they're going to have to speak. People have to speak French and English. I have to speak French and English. You're right. I guess where I'd say let's focus on working together to achieve the objectives of what can happen through an Official Language Act without making, I mean, the concern was that one of the concerns was, well, that would make 70 to 90, depending on you count in official languages. And it seems that we can't get there at this point. Like, I don't know if people will have a conversation about that in the future, but this clearly came up during the discussions we had across Canada, and the government didn't go that way. And I believe Minister Joly has recently confirmed that she's not going down that road in official languages modernization either.
Thank you.
Just a
Thank you.
subsequent question, I guess. So does that mean that the commissioner and the directors will not have to be bilingual French-English? They could be French, their own language, English, their own language?
One of the things about the Office of the Commissioner of Indigenous Languages is that it's not part of the core administration of the Federal Public Service. So those rules about language, French and English don't apply.
Mm.
I couldn't tell you at this point, Amos, whether or not that means the person would have to speak Indigenous languages. That's all to be worked out, but I certainly see that as a potential possibility.
Mhm. Okay. Any other comments or questions? Yeah.
Annie.
Any-
My name is Grace Fox. I'm from Manitoulin Island. And I don't speak English very well, so you'll have to forgive me if I mix up my he's and she's. I'm a residential school survivor. I was in residential school for 14 years. And after residential school, I became a teacher, I became an administrator, and I have a white page full of documents which attest to whatever kind of education I got. So I retired. I do nothing except look after 30 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. And the use of the language always intrigues me because I came out of residential school speaking my language. And it was because we played with each other as Indigenous children. I'm sorry, I cannot say I was strapped for speaking language. I'm sorry, I can't say that I was locked up for speaking my language, but I sure did a lot of study hours for speaking my language. I'm very proud of that fact that I speak my language. My children, I'm sorry, I did not teach the language to my children. My husband and I both spoke the language very fluently. And we did not pass it on to our children because we wanted them to be so-called successful in society. And that is why. They have no problem with the fact that they don't speak the language. They're very proud of the fact that they are Native children and that they are children of a couple who is fluent in the language and practices their culture. This is more important to them than speaking their language. If they had the opportunity, I guess they would. I have one son, he's 55 years old, and he mastered the language to a certain degree. And do you know how he mastered that? Because he was on the skids, he was on the street and drinking a lot with his fellow Indigenous friends. And that's where he learned the language. And today I can phone him. He lives in the city. I can phone him and talk to him in the language and he understands perfectly. He's now trying to write it. So not that he'll ever be a teacher of any sort. My question, I guess after that long, whatever, my question is, it's not really a question. I think it's a statement from the likes of myself. Why we need to teach the language in schools, in universities, in colleges. Why do we have to do that? I never learned my language that way. I don't know how to write it. I don't know how to read it, and I don't care to. But I do enjoy going to ceremonies where the language has to be spoken. And I do say has to be spoken because the spirits do come into ceremonies speaking the language. And how anybody can practice a ceremony if they're talking in English really astounds me all the time. So why do we have to do this? I tried teaching language one time when I was a primary school teacher. I did it just for a year and I couldn't teach it. I couldn't teach it because I didn't have the experiences. I had all this white influence that I gained from residential school, and there was no way that I could project my language in these activities that we were supposed to do in education. So I quit. I didn't teach the language. And I've been asked many, many times, can you teach the language? No, unless you want to pay me $1,000 a day. No, I'm just kidding. No. I don't think teaching the language has any place in education in a colonized classroom, because I have seen native language teachers struggling to teach the language with the boards, with the paper, with mock situations and stuff. I think the language has to come from your heart. And that is what we say to our children. This is how we raised them, 6 of them. And we said, sorry, we didn't do it, but they do respect the language. They do respect people who speak the language. But I think teaching it in schools, pardon the expression, bastardizes the language. And it is not the place to do it, because we all know what the fundamentals are for teaching. We have to set up a vision statement, we have to set objectives, we have to set up a time frame, we have to have evaluation standards, we have to measure progress as to whether we reach this or that, and that is not the way we speak our language. We don't measure our language. We don't say you're you finished grade 1 in language, you finished grade 2. And I think what needs to be given is, you're talking about funding. It seems every time Ottawa, funding. I listened to those things all week this past week, you know, and it's, I can't even write the numbers that they were talking about. But I think what we need is, as Amos mentioned, and Margaret, the lady who passed away, was my friend on Facebook. And we need to go back to the way the Creator intended us to live. And there we find the language to be very valuable. We find it useful. We find it meaningful, rather than a picture of vegetables on a board and naming the vegetables or the clothing. And this is where we need to start, I think. And that doesn't happen in the classroom. We have to be, never mind legislating us and saying by grade 1, they got to do this and so on. But we need to have our elders. Our elders are sitting at home. Look, I live on the res. I've always lived on the res. I even went and did stints in the Cree country and here and there for 20 years. Our elders are sitting at home, speaking the language to each other, looking out of the window, while one person is in the classroom using vegetables, clothing, and so on to teach the language. Our elders are on a very strict budget. I've started to quilt, and I think to myself, boy, would I ever love to have 5 kids teach them how to quilt in my own home. It wouldn't be allowed. I'd have to go through some kind of testing or the report, CRC they call it, before the kids would ever be allowed to come to my house. And they would have to know what words I was going to teach them. And I wouldn't be able to talk like I'm talking right now. I would have to follow a schematic plan. And I think that's not the way we treat our language. Our language belongs to our spirit. We have to see what our spirit is saying in order to speak, what language, what words we need to use. And we need to be involved in activities with our own people. I sit at the bingos. I sit at quilting centers. I sit in people's houses. I'm on the phone with people talking language. And it is so valuable. And I don't know what I was doing teaching school all these years when I could have just sat and talked in Indian all my life. But this is what enriches your spirit. This is what enriches our language. And I think that is what, when all this talk about how much money is the university going to get or any other, we don't think like that as language speakers. But we wish it could be a living experience of learning the language, of teaching them ceremonies. Like if they come to my quilting, then they could do some ceremony. We could go places without a whole bunch of things that schools do. Mm-hmm. And the elders. There was one, I'll give you an example. There was one elder, he was such a soup. In English, you speak basic English like I do. I don't speak the highfalutin language like university people do. So this fellow speaks in Ojibwe. He speaks a very eloquent Ojibwe, good literature in the native language, as opposed to just open the door, close the door, and so on. Anyway, I said to the school, because my grandchildren are all there, some of them, I said, why don't you ask that fellow? I mean, he's a real artist. He can talk good, what you would say, good literature, very excellent Ojibwe. Why don't you ask him? He can come in here and tell stories. You know what the answer I got? He drinks on the weekend. Oh, really? He drinks on the weekend. Well, so he passed away a few months ago. I was very sorry when he passed away, but this is a living language of Ojibwe, and this is where children begin to experience what elders hold in place rather than having making make-believe situations in a classroom with so on.
Mhm.
I think if you remember it's a living language. It's not dead. And we have our own ways of accrediting each other. We don't need to have graphs. We don't need to have all kinds of things that education has in order for us to speak our language. But there are good Indians that don't speak English, very good Indians, excellent speakers, and they speak the language super. So I just caution you before you think money is going to do it, that's all.
Mhm. You're good.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. I guess I would say that the language would not require schools to teach, but a lot of people think that is something that should happen. And I do agree with you, though. I mean, when you're learning a language as your first language, you don't go to school to learn it. You know it, you'll somehow learn more about the grammar rules and how to read it and whatnot. But I did also learn to speak French by speaking it, not learning it in school. I tried the school thing, it didn't work. I had to go work on a farm to learn how to speak French with my father-in-law, my brother-in-law. But I will say that I was speaking to a gentleman from Yukon, he's Tlingit, and he said to me, you know, in a community where there are very few speakers, it can't happen that they speak at home. There aren't enough people that can speak and carry on events. But he said, if we do this right and we are dedicated in our community, then it will be spoken home. And we will not be teaching it in our schools as a second language. It will be teaching as a first language. Now that's a longer term goal, but ultimately the decisions on who teaches and whether schools do it or how it's done elsewhere, I think will ultimately be the community's. People will make those choices. And our job, hopefully, if we do it right, is just to be able to support the various choices that people will make, because there are all kinds of different opinions on how to make it work, for sure. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Any other questions or comments? Yep. I just wanted to know what the autonomy of the commissioner was going to be like. Does it have to what are the strings attached to that position? Is it going to report to Parliament? Is that person going to report to Heritage? Likewise, the directors. Is there any early conversations about that?
Yeah, I think the intention would be that the commissioner will provide an annual report on many things, but I think importantly about the adequacy of funding. That report would be transmitted to the Minister of Canadian Heritage, who is then required to table it in both houses of Parliament.
Mm.
So that's a fairly standard. One of the jobs I've had in the past was working in specific claims, and there's a separate specific claims tribunal. The chairman of the tribunal transmits an annual report to the Minister of Crown Relations now, I believe, and then the Minister of Crown Relations tables it in Parliament. So I hope it puts your mind at ease a bit that this isn't one where the minister can take it back and say, I don't like your report, rewrite it.
Mm.
The minister will table the report as drafted by the commissioner.
Okay.
I would also note, and I forgot to mention this, that there are a number of reviews required on this act. There's a 5-year independent review where somebody will come in and look at how the act's being implemented. And I want to say this was at the House of Commons committee, there was an amendment made so that there would also be a parliamentary review that can be started by either the House of Commons or the Senate within 3 years of the coming into force of the act. So I can tell you that's going to go by in the blink of an eye. So we will have lots of scrutiny, I think, both parliamentary and independently of the commission.
Any other questions? I just have, okay, yes.
And Amos, you're moderating. You can't ask any more
I know,
questions.
I know. I just can't help myself.
If you're too short, you can't ask them either.
No, I'm okay with that. I don't have any of those height restriction things.
Elizabeth Stevens, Danoswanawan, Wada Will Kwadong, Don Jaba, Misa Wada and the Bendogzion. Buddha Wad Mimin Maujibukwe and Ndao. Do Nadamaga Wada Endion. We Kendana one Anishnabimwin. Do Kanumaga Pipichin Thursday evenings. And, so I come from the community and I'm here, I'm interested in the language. I was very inspired by Ms. Fox's story. I just turned, I guess it was 71, who counts anymore, eh? But I retired and I was raised by my great-grandmother where I heard the language originally. I was with her because of the impacts of the residential school on my parent, and a lot of the currents that were historically impacting on every area of our communities. I was taken from that home and put into the city where I spent my next 45 years. I have concentrated since retiring from work to, I think, revive that fire. I am one of the 3 fires, and to feed that fire of language. I believe that as a Buddha Warami, that's one of the laws that we must live by and pass on. So it has been a little bit of a challenge. After being away from community and not talking with other speakers, you find it very difficult to retain fluency. But it's easy to give up and say, well, that's too bad. It's too late. So at 65, I began to invest what time I had in sitting with some of the elders, and I agree, sitting with elders was one of the best things that I did, going to COLLOQUIUM for 2 years and then returning and going to Buketwanong for the next 3 years. And so my families supported that process because they understood that in our community, we don't have a lot of speakers. I call myself somewhat of a sleeper because the gift that my great-grandmother gave me, it obviously didn't go away. I was encouraged by the elders that I was working with at the time. I think one of the challenges that this funding and these resources that are going to become available to the community is, I think it's very important that impact of the federal funding, along with the provincial responsibility, is that the monies have to be made available to support those members in communities who are at the stage where they still have language, but they're not able to speak it, but they understand it, and to support them as a priority to be sitting with one another and being able to recapture, to revitalize, and regain the ability to speak. I think that's a lot of difference with having no language and then trying, because our resources are so, we don't have a lot to draw on. And I think we have to work at fanning the fire. And those are one of the areas to support. The other thing is in the elementary schools and secondary schools, I listened very carefully to the FNMEI reference here, was that I see the dollars, the teachers that are in the positions currently, that the administration is not holding them accountable to ensure that there is actually an effective delivery of services of language to the community. Again, it's no fault of the system at large, but it's obvious that teachers are being put into place who've had one semester of 72 hours of exposure to language, and they're being expected to teach our children how to speak when they perhaps can't speak themselves. And the check mark is being put on that they are in fact delivering services. And if we are going to be using this funding, that I think the elementary, secondary schools, universities, and colleges all have to be have their feet held to the fire, that there is actually language acquisition occurring. Otherwise, we're just going to be here after the $333 million is spent. That accountability is going to be very important, and not just part of the academia as well, getting a large part of that money, because when you have those feet and foot runners in the communities, that creative process that I've heard that's going to be supported by giving the dollars to the communities. But accountability is really going to be very, very important process if we are going to actually produce speakers in the next 5 to 10 years. So I'm just, bottom line question is, are these resources going to be, as they're delivered, a report through this commissioner that's going to be appointed, giving those kinds of information back, and so that communities will know if it is being used effectively or not, and not to wait for the full 5 or 10 years when it's all spent, but to do it on a quarterly basis, maybe even a 6-month or an annual basis. And so that's my question, is the accountability part.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. The commissioner, I think the way we're still in the early days of trying to figure out what the commissioner will do and how the commission will be run. What we heard though was the commission's not, most people that spoke to us didn't want to have the commissioner reporting on activities of communities, but one of the functions that the commissioner could have is studies on the progress that languages are making. And I think nobody that I spoke to had a problem with some sort of accountability. I think though the request was, we all understand that people need to be accountable, but don't have a bunch of people in Ottawa determining what accountability is and telling us. Let us work together on what communities would think success is. So I think what you're suggesting is certainly possible. Now, I'm not sure about the role of the commission in that. So at this point, it's too early for me to be able to tell, really. But thank you for sharing it.
Yeah, I was just saying, that is, I agree with you in the picture, but how is it that we are going to generate people who will speak our language so it's not lost? And after all the money spent, how can we actually measure that and ensure that that doesn't happen?
No, it's certainly.
What brings us here today.
No, it's an important thing. We're going to have to figure out how to measure it and where we're going with it. So thank you for that.
Any other questions or comments? Yeah.
Gwe nin delawisi Lislani Borden nin Tleawin Migamagi Garunin Wedgesquitch. So I'm actually an Acadian Irish settler who speaks Mi'kmaq. Little bit. Gishkabasik. But because I worked in a community in Unamagi for a long time in Cape Breton. I've also taught in Mi'kmaq communities where I've had a room full of pre-service Mi'kmaq teachers, and I'm the most fluent person in the room. And what I recognize is that there's a lot of pain that comes with having lost language. And I wonder how this Indigenous Languages Act is going to account for also some of the healing that needs to happen before people can feel confident in actually learning their own languages. Because I've seen that kind of trauma in my own students, and it's hard for people to begin to learn the language if they still are healing from the effects of colonialism. And I know in the community where I live, we had the Aboriginal Healing Foundation for a long time, and we had a survivors group, and they were doing a lot of work. But I believe the funding for that has ended. And my concern is that we're announcing funding for languages, but we're taking it away from the healing that still needs to happen. So just wondering about that.
It's a difficult, thank you for that. You've asked a difficult question. I don't know that in the sense you mean it, the languages legislation will do what you're suggesting. I mean, I'm hoping that I don't believe that the money that's going into languages is being taken from other healing initiatives. But now I'm way out of my depth on how to fix those kinds of things. So I certainly heard in my travels about the need for healing, and I hope that the promise of the Languages Act helps people take steps down that road by learning their languages, and that communities will decide how best to do that.
Any other questions or comments?
Stephanie Pyle, Woodland Cultural Center and the Canadian Language Museum. I'm just wondering a little bit more about the Language Commissioner. I know so often in all levels of government and politics, we get these beautiful reports and they go in front of a board of people and they get discussed and then they get put on a shelf. So I'm wondering if there's any teeth in the act, or if there's a plan for there to be teeth in the role of the Language Commissioner to make sure that these really important observations that get made in this office can get acted upon and implemented.
So the Language Commissioner will table reports every year on things including adequacy of funding. So if by teeth you mean enforcement, no, there's no enforcement mechanism in here for the Language Commissioner. But being a public servant, I can tell you that once a parliamentary committee starts to look at something and would be influenced by a report, like they'll study these reports, there is a fairly high level of scrutiny placed on that policy initiative by the committees. The parliamentarians will hold public servants to account for the way the act is managed. There's also a number of, as I said earlier, reporting review requirements. So we'll have people both from outside of government and in parliament looking at how the government does about this. So I do think that the reports that the commissioner will do every year will be an important part of the government's accountability for how this act is implemented. I hope that answers your questions.
Any other questions, comments? Yes.
I debated whether to say anything. Thanks, Amos, for acknowledging Gagnon. We're in our 38th year, and yeah, we taught it in the schools. And now we have all our front benches at our ceremonies are all from our students that graduated from our immersion schools. So, and I get really emotional still after 38 years when I see them stand up and talk, because I taught them too. And also they're having kids who are now fluent. My great nephew, his first words were in Moke, because his mom teaches him Cayuga and talks to him in Cayuga, and my nephew teaches and talks to him in Mohawk. So he'll figure it out. I'm here today representing the Unter Native Literacy Coalition. We're the only Indigenous provincial support organization in Canada that represents and supports adult literacy. And about 3 years ago, we fought to have our languages taught in our literacy programs. Now it's a big fight because I only started maybe about 6 years ago in our programs. And at that time, I was like asking, why aren't we teaching it? Because most of our clients are residential school survivors or generational survivors. And we're also now, as of 2 years ago, in the jails. And as I speak, we're still trying to get into federal jails as well. And so in the jails, we can't teach certain things because they're always monitored but we created small resources and they come with CDs and things like that, so that and now people are buying them all over the place because these simple little books started out with like our opening address, and then like maybe just introducing yourself with your clan and your nation and your name and where you're from, things like that. And then things like planting seeds and a song to plant your seeds and a prayer to say. And also welcoming a new baby, because we, like it's a firm belief that the first words that they hear should be in our language. And so from that, some of our clients have learned to say that prayer to open, like Amos did earlier. And we've done it now in a number of different languages, because in our programs, we have to, we're all over Ontario, and especially in the urban centers. So they have to, we have to acknowledge the fact that our people are pretty mobile. And so we have to have languages in all different, because not every one of them are from Six Nations, or not every one of them are from Wiki or wherever. We have all different nationalities in our classroom. So as far as funding is concerned, I'm just wondering about programs like us. Where do we sit in this whole, because we can't, and really, we're pretty taxed. We're a little organization trying to do a big job. But we also have, we can't go to each individual nation and say, can you help us out with funding? Where do we fit in that funding scheme? Because, we're trying to help everybody, and at a very low level too, because I've seen even one of our young men who never even spoke or heard the language learn from one of our little resources, and now he's in an immersion program, and he finished, by the way, his high school too. So we're plugging away, but where do we fit in all this?
Well, I'm not familiar with your organization. I regret that. But nothing that you said made it sound to me like you couldn't be eligible for support. In this year, as part of the transition, there's going to be a limited call out for next year for some proposals. And I would encourage you to take a look when it comes out and speak to our program folks.
So there will be something available because some of our organizations are independent, and some of our programs are independent, and some of them are in I don't know, native centers and some of them are in the AICs and, like we're
Yeah.
all over the place and we don't just fit into one.
I don't want to raise expectations. I don't know enough about your particular situation to know, but it sounds to me like something you should talk to our program experts about and see if they think that there's a problem. I mean, again, nothing you said makes it sound to me like they would be outside the terms and conditions of eligibility, but I'd encourage you to speak to our folks that run the program to see whether or not you can.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question? Yeah.
How do we do that, Ellen?
Any other questions or comments? If not, Ian, do you want to close?
Well, on
yeah?
that note of Helene's, be here tomorrow. That's
Yes.
a very, very good note to end on.
Yes.
Tomorrow we start with a fabulous breakfast at 8:30 a.m. And that will warm you up for the keynote speech by President COLLOQUIUM at 9. Do not miss it. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Steve, for an excellent Q&A. And we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.
Bonjour.